The message today will be a continuation, at least for this morning, it will be a continuation of our study in the book of Romans. A few weeks ago, we started going through at least the main message of Romans, and we started in Romans chapter 1, and we saw that Paul's aim was to prove that everybody needs Christ. And he started by showing that the Gentiles were what I would call outrageous sinners. When they knew God, they would not acknowledge him as God. They rejected him and they turned to the worship of the things of nature. And as a result, God also left them alone. As they left God alone, God left them alone. And the consequence was, first of all and foremost, that they turned to perverted sexual behavior. Primarily, he mentions homosexual behavior and lesbian behavior. And the reason for this was because, as I tried to point out, the reason for this is that without God, all that you have left is a physical. And the greatest impulses of the physical nature are the natural carnal desires for food and for sex. And when there's no God and there's no restraint, then you push those to the limit. And that is why you find that there's this perversion of appetite and there's this perversion of sexual behavior when people push God away from them. So anyway, Paul highlights this as in chapter 1, and he shows you that those people who practice these things are deserving of death according to what the Word of God says. And then he goes on now in chapter 2, and in chapter 2, he's demonstrating to the Jews that they are equally in need of a Savior. They are equally sinners just as much as the Gentiles are. And that is what we looked at last week. I'm going to bring up my Bible and we will just do a quick review of what we looked at last week before we move on to this week's emphasis. So we're in Romans chapter 2, and what we saw last week is that Paul starts out by saying that the Jews, I mean, he doesn't say Jews necessarily, but as you read through, you see that he's talking to the Jews. He's saying that you are inexcusable if you think that you are without fault, because you're judging other people, but you are doing the same things. And he's saying, you judge those who do these things, and then you do the same thing. Do you think you will escape God's judgment? His point is that a profession is not good enough. A profession does not mean, a profession is not the basis of God's approval. And he goes on to say, I mean, we spent a little time looking at this part of the passage, which I think is very often misunderstood, misrepresented, misapplied. He says, not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. And I spent some time last week looking at this to show you that Paul is not contradicting himself. Paul says very clearly that by the deeds of the law shall no flesh be justified in the sight of God. But what he's doing here, he's using the argument of the Jews. He's talking to the Jews and he's using their argument. According to their argument and according to their teachings in the Old Testament and according to their philosophy, it is those who do who will be accepted by God. This is taught very clearly in the law of Moses. The man who doeth these things shall live in them. So he's using that argument and he's saying, look, you think that because you claim to be God's people, this will make you acceptable? Look here. Even though he doesn't express it as simply as I express it, this is what he's saying. Look here. The law itself tells you that it is not those who do, it is not those who hear who will be accepted. It is those who do who will be accepted. It's in the law itself. So he's making them know that just having instructions about what to do is not good enough. And I keep saying that there are so many Christians I can think of today, Christian groups, where this advice is very desperately needed, or people need to take note of this counsel, because it is true. People have the same misconception today. Now, he went on to say that the Gentiles who do not have the law, they do by nature the things contained in the law. And so these become a law to themselves. But this statement was always a little bit of a, what should I say? It always gave me a little pause for question, even though I went along with the normal interpretation. What I learned and what I accepted was that it is saying that there are Gentiles out there in heathen nations. There are Gentiles out there, people who do not know God the way we know God, people who do not have the law, who never heard the law, who never read the Bible, and yet they are doing the things that are right because they have a new heart. The law is written on their hearts. That is how I heard it explained, and that is what I understood. But in studying it again last week or the week before, it just struck me that this is not talking about the heathen out there in idolatrous communities and idolatrous lands. Even though it is possible that there may be an exceptional person in those circumstances who comes to know the true God. But this is not who Paul is talking about. He's talking about the Gentiles who have heard the gospel and have been converted. Paul is talking about the people who have come through his ministry. These Gentiles were not given the law. He says they do not have the law because they were not given the law. Paul did not give the Gentiles the law. Paul made them understand that the law was given to the Jews and it was not for Gentile Christians. And so he says they show the work of the law written in their hearts. Who is it that has the law written in their hearts? It is those people who are under the new covenant. I'll just show you that very quickly. It's those who experience the new covenant, those who are born again, who have the law written in their hearts. Let me just quickly look at Hebrews chapter 8, where it shows you this very clearly. In Hebrews 8, it says, "This is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, said the Lord." Hebrews 8 and verse 10. "I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts. I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people." This is the covenant. This is the new covenant. So this is what he's talking about here in Romans when he talks about these Gentiles. We could have read it. When the Gentile Christians, which have not been given the law, do by nature, and I like the phrase by nature, I'm going to come back to this, even though we dealt with this last week, I'm going to comment on it a little bit more. They are doing by nature the things contained in the law. These, though they do not have the law, they become a law. There's a law that governs their behavior in themselves. And he says this law is the law written in their hearts. This is a born-again Christian. And it is talking about the house of Israel, because look at what he says further down in the chapter, down near the end. "For he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly, but he is a Jew, which is one inwardly." So this is the true house of Israel, the Jew who is one is inwardly. And this is the person that Paul is talking about when he says, they show the work of the law written in their hearts. Why is he saying this to the Romans? Because in the Roman congregation, there were Jews and there were Gentiles. And right here in this chapter, he's focusing especially on the Jews, because the Jews were the ones, I don't know if it was happening in Rome, but primarily the Jews were the ones who kept following Paul's converts and telling them that they needed to do the law. They needed to accept the law and start practicing the law, otherwise they could not be saved. So this is a very sore point with the Apostle Paul, and that is why he's always harping on this issue. And he's telling the Jews that these people they have the law written in their hearts. Now, this is why I highlighted this phrase, they do by nature. This is one of the most striking things about the new covenant that I want to highlight and that I want to reinforce, and I want us all to understand. The old covenant was you do because the written law instructs you to do, so you try to do. There is a law outside of you. It is not your nature. It is not your nature. This is why Paul says, the things that I would, I do not. There's a law inside of me compelling me to do the things that I don't want to do. But the new covenant believers, they do by nature. That's a very striking and important phrase, because what does nature mean? Nature means the way that things work naturally. And we are all familiar with the comparison with, say, for example, the law of gravity. By nature, you throw something in the air, it comes back. By nature, you put your hand on the fire, you feel a sharp pain, you pull it away. By nature. These are not things that you practice or that you are instructed to do. It's just the way life operates. And that's what Paul means when he says, they do by nature. This is the most wonderful thing about the new covenant, because by nature, man has a leaning to do the wrong things. By nature, man has a leaning to go against the laws of God. He has a leaning to do the things that are perverse and that are self-willed. That is the nature of humanity naturally. But Paul says that these Gentiles, and clearly he's speaking of the born-again Gentiles, they do by nature. This means now that out of them something is coming naturally as their normal mode of behavior. And what is this normal mode of behavior? They are doing the things that are contained in the law. What the law says, they are now doing naturally, instinctively, but as a preference in their nature. Their nature draws them in this direction, in other words. I mean, they can resist it, right? You can always go against your nature, but it is unnatural. And just like how when you were a sinner, you naturally did the things that were wrong, and you only went against these things by a struggle. In the same way, when you are born again and the law is written in your heart by the Spirit of the living God, your nature is changed. Now you have a desire to do the things that are good, and you can avoid doing it, but then you have to go against that nature. This is what nature means. And so Paul says, the law is written in their hearts. It's nature. And so their conscience is there speaking to them and letting them know when they go against that nature. And so he says, in the day, this is where we stopped last week, in the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ, then all those who have sinned without the law, that is those Gentiles who didn't have the law, they were living by the law of their conscience and their nature. If they live against that law, contrary to that law, then in the day of judgment, they will be judged accordingly by their conscience, and they will perish without the law, outside of the law, because that's where their religion was. And as many as have sinned in the law, under the law, like the Jews, they will be judged by the law. So he's saying that God has a way to judge everybody. Those who had the law will measure them. Those who didn't have the law, they will be judged by their conscience. That's what he says. Now he goes on to say, and this is where we continue from today now, in verse 17. And what he does in the second half of the chapter is that he is going to reinforce and illustrate the point he has already made. And that is what we're going to be focusing on here today. Sister Elizabeth has her hand up. Go ahead, Sister Elizabeth.
Okay, I'm a little bit confused in what you just said. So we don't want to go, we want to go against nature, but we don't, because naturally, I want to strangle somebody. But now that I've met Jesus, I don't want to disappoint him. So now that he's changed my heart, I want to I want to do what Jesus wants me to do, but I can't do it. It's like it's a struggle. So what are you actually saying that's the right way to do?
All right, let me
Because you
explain.
can't do it in your own stead.
Sure, let me explain
You
something
can't do
that
it in
Paul doesn't mention, but I'm going to bring it into the picture because it's a necessary part of the explanation. Now, Paul talks about behavior on the basis of nature. Now, you're saying that even though you're a Christian, your nature still wants to strangle somebody. All right, I understand. But what I'm going to qualify that by saying that humans possess two natures. Let me make that point very clear because that is what a lot of people don't grasp or understand. We have two natures. So when we talk about the nature, maybe it is necessary to explain what are we talking about. Now, in the arguments that have been involved in our discussions relating to this, people don't recognize that. They don't recognize that there are two natures. Just as how Jesus had two natures, he had a human nature and he had a divine nature. In his human nature, he was completely human. But in his spiritual nature, he was completely divine, which means that in his spirit, he desired only good. He only wanted to do what was right. But in his physical nature, in his body, he had the same kind of urges and the same kind of demands that we have in our body. But because of the spirit in him, he never gave in to the demands of the body. So there are two natures. Now, we also possess two natures. Before you become a Christian, your spiritual nature and your physical nature are completely the same. Both of them are carnal. Both of them are running side by side. When you become a Christian, you are born again. What is born again is your spirit. It is your spiritual nature that changes. Your physical nature remains the same. Your memories are the same. Your reflex, your bodily reflexes remain the same. These are only changed gradually by long practice, by fighting. You can retrain your body. You can retrain your reflexes. You can recontour the memories in your mind and the concepts in your mind. But when you become a Christian, immediately and instantly, your spiritual nature changes. And what does this mean? It means that inside of you now, there is no longer the desire to see people die. There's no longer the desire to see people hurt and suffering. You have an understanding of the condition of all men, and it makes you sympathetic. Now, if a person does not have this, if the love of God is not put in your heart by the Spirit, it may mean that you're not born again. That's what I would say. But when a person is born again, his spiritual nature changes. Now, he still has desires in his mental state will still direct him to do things that he doesn't want to do because this is bad training over the years and these are bad habits developed. But in your spirit, something is changed. And that is why, even if you die, your outward person is not yet completely changed, but your inward person is a new person. So when I talk about nature, and when Paul talks about nature here, he's talking about the spiritual nature. The born again Gentile does not have a new physical nature, not even a new mental nature, but he has a new spiritual nature. And so when Paul says he does by nature, remember he has a conscience now, and the conscience is instructing him. And what is it that is directing the conscience? It's his spiritual nature. It's a new nature. So the new nature is saying to him, this is what you should do. The new nature knows that this is right. The new nature wants this right way and is instructing him. So now your conscience is aware of what this new nature is saying, and your conscience can respond or reject. What we know is that if you accept that this conscience It's the voice of Jesus inside of you. Jesus' nature in you is directing you. If you accept this and you submit to that voice, every moment that you submit to that voice, you become better as a person and better as a Christian. You become stronger. Why? Because you become more aware of the presence of Jesus, and he begins to take greater and greater control of that physical nature. You know, the Bible says we are to walk in the Spirit. How do you do that? Walking is a process. Walking is a lifestyle. Walking is not a mental acknowledgement of doctrine. Walking is a way of living. So to walk in the Spirit means that I'm listening to the voice of the Lord, who is speaking in my spirit, to my conscience, and is making me desire the things that are good. This is a new nature. And I'm responding. The more I respond, the closer my relationship with Jesus, the easier responding becomes. This is why Jesus said, if a man love me, he will keep my word. Which word? He's not talking about the 10 Commandments. He's not talking about the 66 books of the Bible. He means I'm going to be speaking to that person. And if you love me, you will listen and you will respond. And if you do this, what will happen? Look at what he says. And I will manifest myself to him. I love this because recently, I asked the Lord, how can I become more aware of you? I'm trying to recognize you in my life, and I keep forgetting. During the day, I'm trying to walk with Jesus, and I keep forgetting. And this is what the Lord reminded me of. How are you going to walk with Jesus except you walk by responding to him? Life is not lived in the theory of reading or in the theory of doctrine. Life is lived in the practicality of living, walking. Our life is made up of activity. And so in each activity, the Lord keeps saying to us, I don't want you to do this now. Do you respond? Do you obey? You obey. His presence comes stronger. You're aware of him more. He speaks again. You listen. You respond. You feel him more. And so he says, I will manifest myself to him. You become more and more aware of the Lord until you're walking in a state where you can almost feel his hands holding your hand because you are responding to him. And that is what he meant when he says, if a man love me, he will keep my word. Not what is written so much, even though that becomes a part of it, but it means what I am saying to you moment by moment. So, Sister Elizabeth, this when you understand this, you understand what I mean when I say nature. I'm talking about the spiritual nature, and the physical nature does present an obstacle. But as we walk with the Lord, that new nature is directing us. And as we are responding to that nature, as the Lord is speaking to us in that way, we find that the physical nature does not control us.
Beautiful, beautifully put. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Sister Elizabeth. All right. So he goes back to his point in verses 17 and 18. He says, behold, you're called a Jew, and you rest in the law, and you make your boast of God. I'm paraphrasing a little. All right. You know his will. You know his will. You approve the things that are more excellent. You are instructed out of the law. And you are confident that you yourself are a guide of the blind, a light of them which are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, which has the form of knowledge and of the truth in the law. Now, I looked at these 1, 2, 3, I looked at these 4 verses, and honestly, as much as I hate to do this, I can't help doing it. Every Sabbath I do it. Every time I come before you, I keep doing it. But what I mean is, I keep mentioning the concept of many in the Adventist church, because I was in the Adventist church. So I'm very familiar with their attitude. And why does this remind me of them so much? Look at what it says. You are called a Jew. All right, look at what they say. We are God's commandment-keeping people. We are God's special people. We are the remnant. Same, as we would say in Jamaica, same difference. And you rest in the law. Exactly their point of emphasis. We are God's commandment-keeping people. You know his will. You say we have the truth. and you approve the things that are excellent. You say we keep the 10 commandments. You say we keep all 10 commandments. Being instructed out of the law, that's the foundation on which that denomination rests. We keep the law. And you are confident that you yourself are a guide. My place in the world is to instruct and teach and guide people who are blind. My place is to be a light to those who are in darkness. My place is to be an instructor of those who are foolish. I'm a teacher of those without understanding. And look at what Paul says. With all of this, look at what you have. You have the form of knowledge. Why does he say you have the form instead of saying you have knowledge? The reason is because knowledge and truth are more than information. Knowledge and truth are more than information. This is a misconception the Jews always had, that they had the truth because they had the rules. They had the truth because they had the system of the law. Same misconception I grew up with. We are people of the book. We understand the Bible. We have the truth because we keep the law, the commandments. God has given us the truth. It was the same concept. And Paul says what they had, and logically, what these people today have is simply the form. And a form is like a husk. It's like a shell. Something that doesn't have any substance in the middle of it, or inside of that form. He says what you have is a form. You have the form of knowledge and of the truth. So you think you have the truth. You think you have the knowledge that is important. But what you have is a form, just the shape of it. Because what they had was information, not the experience of what these things mean. It's so important for people to understand this. And, I'm going to say this. I'm going to say this, that, we who are in this fellowship this morning, I know that God has blessed us with understanding in many ways, but I just want to put in a word of caution that even as we can look around and see that this is so true, I'm going to say unapologetically and without hesitation that this is so true of the Seventh-day Adventist denomination generally. I would never condemn any group without reservation, because there are individuals who may be an exception, but generally this is a condition of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Anybody who thinks that I'm exaggerating or overdoing it, just remember that the Adventist Church claims that it is the Laodicean church. Every bona fide Seventh-day Adventist believes that their church is the Laodicean church. An amazing confession. But if you want to know if I'm telling the truth when I'm applying this to Seventh-day Adventists, go to Revelation chapter 3, and from verse 14, read what Jesus says about the Laodicean church, and you will see that this is exactly a perfect description right here in Romans chapter 2, verses 17 to 20. So if I take these verses and apply them to the Adventist church, I am perfectly in harmony with the beliefs of Adventists themselves. So Paul says what they have only is a form. And so he goes on to say, you therefore, who are teaching people, you teach another. Don't you teach yourself? Teachest thou not thyself? Thou that preachest that a man should not steal, dost thou steal? So what he's doing now, he's moving them from theory to practice. I don't know, this should have been a common principle of the teaching of the Jews. Every Sabbath in their synagogues, they should have been preaching this message. It's not good enough to have the law. We need to live the law. And yet, it's obvious that they were not preaching it, because the leaders themselves were the most guilty of breaking every principle of the law while they taught the law. This is why Jesus could say to them, all that the Pharisees And the elders say to you, do, but do not do according to their works. Jesus was trying to emphasize the necessity of moving from theory to practice. Now, of course, we understand that without Christ, nobody can keep the law, nobody can live righteously. But that is not the point, and that was not the point. The point was that they had become satisfied in the condition of simply knowing. And when Jesus said, do what they do, do what they say, and don't just follow their example of just saying and not doing. What he was trying to say was he wanted them to understand that they needed something more. That condition of simply stating what you believe, having a statement, that's a good way of putting it. That condition of simply having a statement of beliefs and saying, this is who we are. My goodness, that is such a legalistic, perverted way of identification. That's one of the reasons, I don't suppose it's the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why many times people have asked me, do you have a statement that outlines what you believe? As a matter of fact, just a couple of weeks ago, somebody, I think from Australia, asked me if we have a statement of beliefs. And I'm always tempted to put something together because it's nice to have a simple way of expressing what you believe. But I've avoided doing it because sometimes when you do it, it leads people to the place where they mistake the statement for the reality. They think that because I can say yes to these statements, that qualifies me. That misconception is a dangerous misconception. It was the curse of the Jews because they had their statement of beliefs in the law of Moses. It's the curse of Adventism. They have their 28 fundamental beliefs. And I mean, it's not just the beliefs. It's the fact that people put these beliefs in stone, make them unchangeable, make them like an infallible document. That's one. And also because these beliefs, they embrace them and they go no further. But anyway, I'm not saying that one day I might not try to put in a simple form what I believe to be the most important teachings, because it's convenient when people want to understand what you believe. But a great deal of care needs to be taken because people tend to take these statements, these documents, and use them to identify who they are and to leave it there. And Paul says this is only the form. The most important thing is, where do you go having this form? What does it lead you into? He goes on to say, you who say a man should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You that hate idols, do you commit sacrilege? So he's going through a list of things here. He's mentioning a few things here that these Jews were openly guilty of. Just needed my fun. Then he goes on to say in verse 23, you who make your boast of the law. There you have in that statement the epitome of what these Jews took pride in. You make your boast of the law. And you know, even though this morning my purpose is not to attack Adventism. My purpose is not to attack Adventism, but it's very difficult to read that and not make a comment. Because Paul said that for the Jews, they were making their boast of the law. What does that mean? It meant that their greatest identifying qualification, their greatest element that they took the most pride in, what made them recognize themselves as special to God was the law. My goodness. It's so very clear It's so very clear that this is the same exact thing that happens today in the Seventh-day Adventist congregation. Their boast is in the law, right? It's become the identification. We are God's commandment-keeping people. That's the basis on which they claim to have their identity. Now, he goes on to say, for the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, as it is written. So I don't know what Paul is quoting from. He says it is written. I suppose it's written somewhere in the Old Testament. Let me see if I can find a reference. He's actually quoting from Isaiah 52 and verse 5. Let me bring it up. Isaiah 52 and verse 5. He says, now therefore, what have I here, said the Lord, that my people is taken away for naught? They that rule over them make them to howl, said the Lord, and my name continually, every day, is blasphemed. So Paul was actually quoting from the Old Testament. This version of the Bible I have here shows you because it is written in bold. It's bolded letters, and so you can know it's a quotation. So Paul says, as it is written. Now, look at what he says next in verse 25. For circumcision verily profiteth if you keep the law. Really? So if you keep the law, circumcision is profitable. Now, what does Paul mean by this? Because I could say, and I think most of you might agree, that circumcision is unprofitable. It's vain, it's useless. Why does Paul say circumcision is profitable if you keep the law? As a matter of fact, I'm going to show you another verse where he says it maybe in a reverse way, but it's basically the same thing. It will help us to understand this. We actually looked at this when we were going through the book of Galatians. If you look at Galatians chapter 5, it says in verse 3, for I verily testify again to every man that is circumcised that he is a debtor to do the whole law. If I may paraphrase, I'm telling you, everybody who gets himself circumcised is bound by duty. He's duty bound to do the entire law. That's what Paul is saying. So if you become circumcised because the law says you must do it, what rational, sensible reason you have for not doing the rest of the law? Because once you acknowledge the claim of the law in one point, this is what he's saying. I don't want us to miss this. Once you acknowledge that the law has authority over you in even one point, then you have no reason for rejecting all the other points. I mean, what could I, you know the phrase that we have in English. It's something like in for a penny, in for a pound. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but what it means is that if you put your finger through the door, if your finger is legitimately put through the door, then it means that your entire body is qualified. Something like that. Maybe not a perfect example, but what he means is that if you acknowledge that somebody has authority over you in one thing, you are giving that person authority over you in everything. This is what happened to Adam and Eve in the garden. They gave Satan authority over them in one little thing they taught, just in eating a fruit. But the result was that their entire world, their entire environment, everything in their circumstances came under the dominion of Satan. That one little subjection acknowledged his right over their entire universe. When I say universe, I mean the world, okay? So, in the same way, Paul is saying that once you open the door to the law and you let in circumcision, you accept the authority, you have accepted the authority of the law over your life, and so you have a duty, you are bound by duty to do the whole thing. Now, of course, the terrible truth, the terrible corresponding truth that goes along with that is in verse 2. Is in verse 2. For behold, I, Paul, say unto you that if you are circumcised, okay, you are circumcised, you open the door, you let in circumcision, now you have let in the whole law, you must do the whole law. Christ shall profit you nothing. In this Christian experience, there are not two doors. There's not 1.5 door. There's not one door plus 0.5% on the other side. It is all or nothing. That's what Paul is saying. And I love that extremism. I love the clarity. If you go the way of the law, Christ is eliminated. If you go the way of Christ, the law is eliminated. Circumcision is just a way of opening the door, one way of opening the door. You do it by circumcision, you do it by feast keeping, you do it by many different ways. You acknowledge the obligation to the law in one area. It means that you're obligated in all areas. And then you can forget about Christ. This is what Paul is saying. You might disagree with me. Fine. But just know that when you disagree, you are disagreeing with Paul also. This is why, and Paul got his gospel from Jesus Christ. So this is what Paul is saying. Circumcision is profitable if you keep the law. Yes, I agree with him. So go ahead and do it. You are circumcised. Keep the law. Keep which law? The whole law, everything. If you take the way of circumcision and you take the way of the law, you must do everything and you must do it perfectly. So Paul is saying, okay, you Jews, you believe in circumcision, you make your boast in the law. All right, circumcision is okay. So you have to keep the entire law. If you keep the law, it's okay. But since you can't keep it and you have never kept it, you're barking up the wrong tree. You're hitting your head against a stone wall. You are indulging yourself in vain nonsense. That way, that road never brought salvation, never can, never will. The only way is Jesus Christ. But to obtain Jesus, you must reject the old way. That is his entire point. Now, in this chapter, he's really showing them that they are coming short of the mark because the evidence is that they are not keeping the law at all. The law with circumcision was intended to make you keep the law and be righteous. But what he's saying is that you never did it. You had the law with your rules and the circumcision and you never kept it. So what's the point of having the rules? You boast about being God's people. You say you're a teacher of the ignorant. You say you're a light to those who are in darkness. You say you're eyes to those who are blind. You boast that you have the law and you don't keep it. What is the point? What do you have? You have nothing. You better forget this road, is what he's saying, and turn to the road of Jesus Christ. And he's really going to make that point more completely in the next chapter, which is chapter 3, which is next week. But anyway, let's get his point fully before we move on to chapter 3 next week. Now he says, yes, circumcision is profitable if you keep the law. All right. But you better keep it. But if you be a breaker of the law, your circumcision is made uncircumcision. What he's saying is that you are circumcised, the Gentiles are uncircumcised, you are not different from them. Your circumcision is the same as uncircumcision because you and clearly the godless Gentiles, you are doing the same thing. You are a thief, you commit adultery, you commit sacrilege. It doesn't matter what you say, you are doing these things just like the uncircumcised Gentiles. Your circumcision means nothing. Therefore, if the uncircumcision keep the righteousness of the law, now he's talking about the converted Gentiles, the born-again Gentiles. If these uncircumcised are keeping the righteousness of the law, they don't have the law, but they are living the principles of the law. What the law says is what they are experiencing in their lives. They don't have the law. They don't consider themselves to have the oracles of God. They don't make their boast in the law. They don't say we have the truth because we have the law. They are simply born again through the Spirit of God. And what happens? They are now keeping the righteousness of the law. They are living different lives. And that's what I want to emphasize for you, brothers and sisters, you here with me in the room, that let us make sure that what Paul is saying to these Jews is not fulfilled in our experience. Let's recognize that being born again is not a license to become reckless and lawless. We are not under the law, but the Spirit of Christ in us has given us new hearts, and these new hearts cause us to live the righteousness of the law, even though we are not under the law. We walk in harmony with the law, not because we have our eyes on the law, not because we are boasting on the law, not because we are talking and making our arguments on the basis of the law. But the Spirit of Christ in us is a stronger motivator. The new nature is a stronger motivator than anything we ever found when we were under the law. And so Paul says, we are in this condition. Shall not his uncircumcision be counted for circumcision? And you know, I'm going to put in something a little, what should I say? Interesting, I would think. You know, it's interesting how the Bible so often establishes these truths on the basis of of males. Because I'm just thinking, you know that for women this is irrelevant. This argument is irrelevant. You know why? Because women never were supposed to be circumcised. I mean, it's only in one perverse religious society in Africa, I think, that they do female circumcision. It was never, ever something that God instructed or expected. So all the arguments are on the basis of males. For women, this was never an issue because neither Gentiles nor Jews, women were not circumcised. Women always had to be accepted on the basis of their relationship, not on the basis of the mutilation of their flesh. So it's interesting that Paul's argument here, and it's a biblical argument, it's God's argument, but it's interesting, it's only applicable when you look at us from the perspective of males. It's easy to understand if you look at female Christians. Uncircumcision is counted for circumcision. Among women, it's an irrelevant argument. You're either a Christian because you have the Spirit of Christ, or you're a Christian because you don't. Circumcision doesn't come into the conversation. Just a little interesting sidelight that I just noticed and I wanted to just mention. Now, he says, so if the Gentile is uncircumcised, his uncircumcision will be counted for circumcision. It means that God will accept him as righteous in his uncircumcised state. Circumcision was supposed to be a mark of righteousness for those who are circumcised, but the righteousness was not fulfilled because they did not keep the law. So Paul says the uncircumcision of these Gentiles, they will be counted as though they are circumcised. In other words, he's saying they are going to be counted as righteous. And shall not uncircumcision, which is by nature. Now he's talking about physical nature. Just to make that distinction. So uncircumcision is by physical nature. You are born uncircumcised. That's why it is by nature. It's the natural way, the natural state of a male when he's born. He's uncircumcised. So you are in a natural condition. If it fulfill the law, if you in this uncircumcised state are walking in the way that the law demanded, it becomes a judge to you. It will judge you. It will be a means of condemning you who, although you have the letter and you are circumcised physically, you do transgress the law. So the point he's making is that the behavior, the lifestyle of these converted Gentiles is a rebuke and a condemnation to you Jews. You have all the theory, you have all the arguments, you have the word, you have all the information, but you don't live it. And here are people who do not have this law and these words and this information, but they are living it. They become a condemnation to you. The argument is eternal. The argument is irrefutable. Nobody can deny it. The argument was true then, 2,000 years ago. It is true today. The names of these groups may change, but the principle remains the same. The truth remains eternal. God produces righteousness through the new birth. The law never did. It says in verse 28, and we come to the end here almost. I'm going to stop in a moment. Today is the day when I really need to go to the chapel for that face-to-face. So it's one of those days when I have to make sure I finish in time. It says, for he is not a Jew. Now he comes down to the simple spiritual reality. He is not a Jew, which is one outwardly. And people say, what? Those Christian nationalists in America would say, what? The people down there in Palestine today fighting the war would say, what? We are the true Jews. We are the true Israel. Paul says, he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly. You could circumcise a little more. You could mark your face. You could go through all the rituals of the law. You are not a Jew. What Paul is telling them is that God's definition of a Jew has changed. God does not change, but his definitions are adjusted because his definitions are based on spiritual reality. God looks at the heart while man looks at the outward appearance. So in the eyes of God, we might say, he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly. That's not God's Jew. Neither is that circumcision, which is outward in the flesh. That's not God's circumcision. And we, being the people of God, who desire the way of God, what we want is God's definition. What we want is God's understanding. What we want is God's spiritual perspective. And so in the eyes of God, he is a Jew, which is one inwardly. I am a Jew. You are Jews. We are all Jews in the spiritual sense. And that is why out of our nation will come the 144,000. Maybe even some of us in this room. And circumcision is that of the heart in the spirit. That is where true Christianity is. That is what God is concerned with. And as we are the children of God, brothers and sisters, let us make a commitment. Let us endeavor with all our hearts to understand things from that spiritual perspective. Let us not fall into the mistake, the misconception, the perversion of those Christians who try to make a mongrel out of the religion of Christ and try to mingle both the law and the Christian life into one conglomeration. No. Let us see as God sees and not as men see, because Paul says, and not in the letter. Circumcision is that of the heart. It's what happens in your heart. It's not what happens outside by an external definition, by a form. And in this case, these are the people whose praise is not of men but of God. That's the phrase on which I want to make my final point. Whose praise is not of men but of God? I mean, human beings will praise you when you belong to a denomination. One of the first questions I will ask is, which church do you go to? Human approval necessitates you having a label and a name. And then they will ask, what do you believe? Let's have a statement of beliefs. And they look at your statement of beliefs and they will approve you because of the statement of beliefs. If you seek the praise of men, you conform to these norms. But Paul says that the true people of God, their praise is not of men, it's not outward, it's not circumcision, it's not a statement of beliefs, it's not a form of truth in the law. It is the heart that is transformed. Their praise is not of men, it is of God. Because man looks at the outward appearance, but God sees the heart.
Amen.
This is something I remind myself of all the time. There is such a human tendency, there is such a curse on us as humans. We want to be approved. You want that when people come online, they say, this brother is speaking the truth because he's teaching just like my church. You want that when somebody asks you, what do you believe? And you tell them, they say, good brother, wonderful. You don't want them to say, you're a cult, you belong to a cult. You don't want to be disapproved. You don't want to be frowned upon. You don't want people to spit and turn away when your name is called. But we, brothers and sisters, our praise should not be of men, but of God. We should rejoice that our names are written in heaven. And though the whole world convene against us, like the song says, it is enough that you come and you bow before our God and you say, oh Father, to know that you approve me is all that I ever ask or want in this world. Though I'm hated and my name is mud, and my family even is ashamed of me, to know that you can say to me, well done, my child, that is all I will ever desire. That is what our Father wants of us, brothers and sisters. May this be the guiding light for our eyes and the burning in our hearts that make us become what he wants us to become.
Amen.
Thank you very much. God bless you all.